So today I want to talk about something that most people are completely missing about what just happened in the Strait of Hormuz. Everyone is watching the military updates. Everyone is watching the shipping alerts in the insurance market. Reports, everyone is watching what Iran said, but almost nobody is asking the question that actually matters most to ordinary people right now. Why hasn't China said a single word? Because China is Iran's largest oil customer. China depends on the Strait of Hormuz for a significant portion of the energy that powers its entire economy. If Iran just changed the rules in one of the most critical shipping lanes on the planet, China has every reason to speak, and yet that silence is not an accident. That silence is not oversight. That silence is a message. And once you understand what that message means, you will understand more about where global power is actually heading than anything else you will hear this week. The answer, when you look at it carefully, is that Iran's move in Hormuz and China's deliberate silence together represent a coordinated shift in how the world's second and third largest economies are choosing to position themselves against the system that has governed global energy, global trade. And your job, your energy bill, your savings, and your future for the past 50 years. So today I want to walk you through exactly what Iran changed, what China's silence is communicating, and what every major power on earth now has to decide, part by part, step by step. So let us begin. The first thing you need to understand, the foundation of everything else I am going to tell you today, is what the Strait of Hormuz actually is and why it matters to every person on earth, regardless of whether they have ever heard of it. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway at its most constricted point, just 21 miles wide, that sits between Iran on one side and Oman and the UAE on the other. Through that 21-mile channel passes approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply. 1 in every 5 barrels of oil consumed on Earth moves through the Strait of Hormuz. That includes the oil that heats European homes, powers Asian factories, fuels American supply chains, and keeps food moving from farms to supermarkets across the developing world. No other single choke point on Earth concentrates that much economic consequence in that small a geographic space. The Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the Malacca Strait, all of them are critical. None of them carry the same proportion of the world's single most essential commodity. For the past 4 decades, the unspoken rule governing the Strait of Hormuz has been simple. America guarantees freedom of navigation. The U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet, based in Bahrain, exists primarily to enforce that guarantee. As long as that guarantee held, the global economy could treat Hormuz as a reliable artery, certain to function, certain to flow. The question is no longer whether Iran has the capability to disrupt that artery. Iran has demonstrated that capability repeatedly. The question is whether Iran has now decided to change the rules that govern how that capability gets used, and whether America still has the will and the bandwidth to enforce the old rules against a nation that is operating inside a new strategic framework backed by China. The answer to that question will determine the price of energy in your home, the stability of your food supply, and the security of your savings for years to come. Let me walk you through every major player in this situation with that framework in mind. On the surface, Iran looks like a nation that has been provoking the international community for decades, seizing tankers, harassing shipping, firing missiles in the general direction of naval vessels. On the surface, what happened in Hormuz looks like more of the same. But underneath that surface, something structurally different occurred. Iran did not simply harass a vessel or fire a warning shot. Iran formally communicated through both military positioning and diplomatic backchannels that it considers itself no longer bound by the informal rules that have governed its behavior in the Strait since the 988 tanker war. Those informal rules were essentially this: Iran could threaten, could posture, could occasionally seize a vessel to make a political point, but Iran would not actually close the strait, because closing the strait would trigger an American military response that Iran could not survive. That was the deterrence architecture. Iran accepted limits on its behavior because the cost of exceeding them was existential. What changed is the Iranian government's calculation of that cost. With 1.5 million barrels of oil per day flowing to China in yuan outside the dollar system entirely, Iran now has an economic lifeline that did not exist in 1988. With Russian military technology and diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council, Iran has strategic protection it did not have before. And with America visibly managing its debt and its domestic politics, and multiple simultaneous geopolitical commitments, Iran has recalculated that the cost of pushing further is lower than at any point in the past 4 decades. For ordinary Iranian families, none of this geopolitical repositioning has translated into economic relief. Inflation remains severe. The currency remains deeply devalued. Daily life remains genuinely difficult for millions of people. But for the Iranian government, changing the rules in Hormuz is not a reckless gamble. It is a calculated bet made possible by a changed strategic environment. Now let us look at the nation whose silence is the most revealing response to that bet. On the surface, China looks like a nation with every reason to be alarmed by what Iran just did. China imports approximately 40% of its total energy needs, with a significant portion of that supply transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Any serious disruption to Hormuz shipping is, on paper, a direct threat to China's energy security and therefore to its entire economic model. A nation that, dependent on a choke point that just got more dangerous, should be speaking urgently. It should be calling for de-escalation. It should be contacting every relevant party and making its concerns publicly known. That is what a nation protecting its interests looks like. China said nothing. Underneath that surface, China's silence is the most carefully constructed diplomatic signal in this entire situation. Here is what it communicates. China is not alarmed by Iran's move because China was not surprised by Iran's move. A nation is only publicly alarmed by development it did not anticipate. China anticipated this, and that means the coordination between Tehran and Beijing runs significantly deeper than the public record of their relationship suggests. The $400 billion 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement that China and Iran signed in 2021 is the visible layer of that relationship. The energy settlements in yuan, the technology transfers, the quiet diplomatic alignment at the United Nations, these are parts of the visible record. But China's silence this week suggests there is a layer of strategic coordination beneath the visible record. That includes an understanding about Hormuz specifically. China's calculation is this. Every day that Iran holds a more assertive position in Hormuz without triggering a full American military response is a day that proves the alternative system is working. It is a day that demonstrates to every other nation watching, India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the smaller nations of Southeast Asia and Africa, that operating outside American rules carries lower costs than previously believed. China does not need to say anything. Iran is doing the speaking. And China's silence is the most powerful endorsement Iran could receive. For ordinary Chinese families navigating a difficult economic period, this strategic game is invisible, but its consequences for energy prices, for trade routes, for the long-term shape of the global economy will land on their lives within this decade. On the surface, America remains the world's indispensable military power. Its navy is without equal. Its carrier strike groups can be repositioned anywhere on Earth within days. Its alliance network spans every inhabited continent. When America decides to act, the consequences for any adversary are severe. But underneath that surface, America is navigating a strategic environment more complex than anything its military planners have faced since the Cold War. The debt figure is $39 trillion. That number matters not just as an abstract financial statistic, but because of what it means operationally. Sustaining the petrodollar system, the mechanism that allows America to borrow at relatively lower Cost and project power globally requires that the world continues to need and use US dollars to buy oil. Every barrel of Iranian oil sold to China in yuan is one fewer transaction, reinforcing that demand. Every day, the alternative system expands is a day the financial foundation of American power erodes slightly. America is also managing simultaneous commitments that would have been difficult even in periods of greater fiscal and political strength: support for Ukraine, deterrence in the South China Sea, the evolving situation with Israel and Iran, NATO alliance obligations, and the domestic political pressures that now accompany every foreign policy decision. These commitments are not individually unmanageable. Together, they create a bandwidth problem that adversaries can exploit. Iran changing the rules in Hormuz is an exploitation of that bandwidth problem. Iran is not betting that America cannot respond. Iran is betting that America will calculate the response as too costly. Given everything else it is managing simultaneously, so far that bet appears to be holding. America has not been silent out of indifference. America's silence, like China's, is a calculation, a weighing of costs that includes the price of energy for ordinary American families, the stability of allied governments in Europe, and the long-term sustainability of the financial architecture that makes American power possible. America is still the most capable nation on earth to navigate this period. Its resource wealth is extraordinary, but the Hormuz moment is a test of whether capability and will remain aligned. On the surface, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, look like the nations with the most direct stake in keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. Their oil exports transit that strait. Their economic existence depends on it. They should be the loudest voices demanding that Iran step back from whatever it just changed. But underneath that surface, the Gulf states are in the most uncomfortable strategic position of any major player in this situation. Their security architecture is built on American protection. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. American air bases operate across Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The implicit guarantee of American military response to any Iranian aggression is what has allowed Gulf governments to invest in economic modernization rather than defense buildup. That guarantee is now being quietly questioned, not because America has withdrawn it explicitly, but because Iran is testing it, and the response has been silence. Saudi Arabia has already begun hedging. In 2023, it re-established diplomatic relations with Iran, a move that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. Brokered by China, the UAE has been carefully positioning itself as a neutral financial hub, accessible to both Western and non-Western economic systems. Qatar, which hosts the largest American airbase in the Middle East, has simultaneously maintained energy relationships with actors outside the American orbit. These are not acts of betrayal toward America. They are the rational responses of governments that are reading the strategic situation clearly. The Gulf states built their modern identities. The desalination plants, the air-conditioned cities, the financial centers, the global aviation hubs, on a foundation of cheap energy revenues protected by American military guarantees. If that foundation becomes less certain, hedging is not disloyalty. It is survival. For ordinary Gulf families, the discomfort is real but not yet acute. The wealth accumulated over decades provides a significant buffer. But the direction of travel toward a world where American guarantees are conditional and the alternatives are still being built is a direction that every Gulf government is now planning for in ways they were not 5 years ago. On the surface, Europe and the major Asian economies, Japan, South Korea, India, the nations of Southeast Asia are observers in the Hormuz situation. They did not create it. They did not choose it. They are not parties to the decisions being made in Tehran, Beijing, or Washington. But underneath that surface, they are the nations that will pay the most immediate economic price if the Strait of Hormuz becomes genuinely contested. Europe is still recovering from the energy price shock triggered by the Ukraine war. Average household energy bills across Germany, France, and the United Kingdom rose by 40 to 60% in the period. Following that disruption, governments fell. Political movements shifted. The social contract between European governments and their citizens was strained in ways that have not fully healed. A new energy disruption, even a moderate one, arriving. On top of that, unhealed strain is not a theoretical problem. It is a political emergency. Japan imports nearly all of its oil. South Korea imports approximately 70% of its energy. India, as noted earlier, imports 60% of its oil from the Gulf, much of it through Hormuz. These nations have no ability to insulate themselves from a sustained increase in the risk premium on Gulf energy. Higher insurance costs, longer shipping routes, reduced supply reliability, all of it translates directly into higher prices for ordinary families already managing constrained household budgets. And here is the compounding problem. These nations do not have a seat at the table where the Hormuz rules are being renegotiated. They will accept whatever outcome Iran, America, and China negotiate, or fail to negotiate, and absorb the consequences through their energy bills, their food prices, and their economic growth rates. For ordinary families in Tokyo, Seoul, Mumbai, Paris, and Berlin, the moves being made in the Strait of Hormuz are not distant geopolitical events. They are the upstream cause of the prices they will pay at the pump and in the supermarket within months. So now let us zoom out and look at the biggest picture of all. Because when you place Iran's move in Hormuz, China's silence, America's bandwidth constraints, the Gulf states hedging, and Europe and Asia's exposure all on the same map, you see something that is bigger than any individual actor's strategy. You see a choke point moment not just in the Strait of Hormuz, but in the history of the global order itself. The Strait of Hormuz has always been the physical embodiment of a political guarantee that America would keep global energy flowing, that the rules of navigation would be enforced, that no regional power could unilaterally disrupt the supply chain that the entire world economy depends on. That political guarantee is what gave the global economy the confidence to build itself around Gulf energy, to build factories in Asia, suburbs in America, and financial centers in the Gulf, all on the assumption that the energy would keep flowing. What Iran just did is challenge whether that guarantee still operates at full strength. And China's silence is the most powerful possible signal that the answer, from Beijing's perspective, is that it does not. And here is the crucial insight that most people are completely missing. This is not primarily a military story. The Strait of Hormuz has not been physically closed. Ships are still moving. Oil is still flowing. The disruption so far is to confidence to the assumed certainty that the old rules will be enforced. And in global markets, confidence disruptions have real consequences long before physical disruptions arrive. Insurance costs for Gulf shipping have already risen sharply. Shipping companies are already calculating alternative route costs. Energy traders are already pricing a risk premium into future contracts. These are not hypothetical impacts. They are happening now in the background of the headlines, and they are already working their way toward the energy bills and food prices of ordinary families in every major economy. The nations that survive the next decade most successfully will be those that read this moment for what it is. Not a single crisis to be managed and forgotten, but the opening of a sustained period of structural uncertainty in the energy and trade architecture that the modern world was built on. That uncertainty is not going to resolve quickly. It is going to require governments, businesses, and ordinary families to think differently about where their energy comes from, how their supply chains are structured, and how exposed they are to a system whose rules are actively being renegotiated. That is what a choke point moment looks like, and we are inside one right now. I want to end with the most surprising conclusion of this entire analysis. You might expect me to say that the story here is about the decline of American power. America stayed silent. Iran changed the rules. China endorsed it through silence. The conclusion most people would draw is that America is losing and the alternative system is winning. But actually, no. The most important story coming out of the Hormuz moment is not about American decline. It is about what China is actually risking and whether Beijing's silence reflects confidence or a calculation that could unravel. Here is what most coverage misses entirely. China needs Hormuz more than America does. America has become increasingly energy self-sufficient over the past decade through its own oil and gas production. America can absorb a prolonged Hormuz disruption painfully, expensively, but survivably. China, importing 40% of its energy through a strait it does not control and cannot militarily protect at the distances involved, cannot absorb that disruption without severe economic consequences. China's silence this week is a bet that Iran will not actually close the strait, that the rules will shift just enough to demonstrate the alternative system's viability without tipping into a disruption that damages China's own economy. It is a bet that America will stay constrained just long enough for the alternative architecture to develop further critical mass. And it is a bet that the Gulf states will continue hedging rather than firmly reinforcing the American-led system. That is a sophisticated bet, but it is a bet that depends on Iran acting with more strategic restraint than Iran has historically demonstrated. And it is a bet where the downside, a genuine Hormuz closure that devastates Chinese energy supply, falls almost entirely on China, not on America. China's silence tells you everything about China's confidence, but it may also tell you something about China's vulnerability. The patient architect of an alternative system is also the nation most exposed if that system's test run goes further than planned. That is the paradox at the center of this moment. And it is one that the most powerful players in this situation are all calculating simultaneously. So let us just recap what we covered today. Iran changed the rules in Hormuz, not with a physical closure, but with a formal shift in its posture that signals it no longer considers itself bound by the informal deterrence rules that have governed the strait since 1988. That shift was made possible by Iran's energy lifeline to China, its Russian strategic cover, and its recalculation of American willingness to respond. China said nothing, and that silence is the most revealing signal in this entire situation. China's silence tells you that Tehran and Beijing have a level of strategic coordination that goes beyond what the public record shows, and that China sees Iran's move as a validation of the alternative economic architecture both nations have been building. America is managing simultaneous commitments, $39 trillion in debt, and the domestic political sensitivity of energy prices, all of which constrain its response options in ways that Iran and China have carefully calculated. The Gulf states are hedging, quietly building relationships with China while maintaining their American security relationships, because every serious Gulf government is now planning for a world where American protection is conditional rather than guaranteed. Europe and Asia are the price payers, nations with enormous exposure to any Hormuz disruption and almost no seat at the table where the new rules are being set. Their households will absorb the consequences through energy bills and food prices. And the most surprising conclusion, China's silence reflects confidence, but also a significant vulnerability, because China needs Hormuz more than America does. And the bet China is making depends on Iran exercising restraint. That history does not guarantee. This is a choke point moment, not just in the Strait of Hormuz, but in the global order itself. The rules are being renegotiated. The confidence architecture is under pressure, and the decisions being made this week will shape the energy costs, trade routes, and economic security of ordinary families for the decade ahead. Subscribe for more analysis of the forces reshaping our world, explained in simple English. And tell me in the comments, do you think China's silence reflects genuine strategic confidence? Or is China taking a risk it is not fully accounted for? I will see you next time.